Next agenda item is on student assessments, and I think we have the same cast of characters for the discussion. So without reintroduction, Dr. Morgan, Dr. Eaton, would you please take it away?
Thank you very much. This is a favorite topic of ours. So you had asked, in understanding the decisions around making recommendations or resolutions around specific assessments, that we look at all of the assessments. So we did a first dive, and you will see from just this first dive that if we want further dives, we can, but an hour and a half will be taken up by a first dive. So I wanted to do a little bit of contextualizing, and did I turn this off? Hold on. So one of the important considerations that we discussed earlier was it's really important to have that consistency around what we expect students to know and be able to do. So when we think about what's the learning that students are doing, we know that they're learning knowledge and skills, and that's absolutely critical to the foundation of their ability to be able to apply. And looking at that application level of being able to do the learning. And ultimately, the expectation to be career and college ready is that you can transfer that learning to be able to use it in a way that's beyond academics. So when we think about what students are supposed to know and be able to do, we really want to be thoughtful about how we're setting those expectations and then how we're measuring them. The other important component about the assessment landscape is the purpose for the assessments. And so we have a lot of assessments, and we have assessment that is more process, meaning it's part of the learning process. And we have assessment, what I would call testing, which is an event, not necessarily good or bad, I'm just saying it's an event that's a freeze moment in the teaching and learning process to test a specific learning, a set of learning outcomes. Instruction is one purpose for assessment, and that's to inform the students about how they're doing, and the teachers about how the instruction is helping the student learn. We also want to have some point in time when we're able to have comparability. Comparability is critical so that we do not have a case where any students are disadvantaged by their learning opportunities. We want to ensure that students have that guarantee of a set of learning priorities that we expect for all of our students. It also provides the opportunity for instructional effectiveness so that we know through, regardless of what English class I'm in my high school, that I know that I'm getting a quality English learning opportunity, and that there's that ability to ensure that across those classes. The last purpose for assessment is accountability, and we have what I call big A and little a accountability. So little a accountability is the accountability of the student is accountable to their learning. And we really want to ensure that self-directiveness, because that is a skill that we know in college and career readiness is critical. That self-directiveness, I know my strengths, I know my needs, and I am also self-advocate for my learning. So we really want to help students have that little a accountability. Teachers as well has that accountability, so teachers are holding the learning in their classrooms accountable to the expectations, ensuring that they're able to provide the quality of education and the instruction and the differentiation to meet the students' needs. And then the school is holding itself accountable to ensuring that the resources are available to those teachers and students for the learning, and that they're meeting the targets that are set for the school. Then we have big A accountability, and that's the district level accountability, the expectations that the board sets, that the district sets for schools through school accreditation, and then the state sets for districts. So when we think about the assessments that are measuring the learning, we know that the classroom assessments are a valued and very integral part of measuring the instruction. And those assessments happen frequently directly integrated with the learning, and they can measure all levels of learning. We also have common assessments. Common assessments can be assessments that are built by a grade level, by a school. They also can be DIBELS. DIBELS is a common assessment. We all give DIBELS, in our school or across schools. That gives us ability to compare performance. Depending on the technical rigor, which just means its ability to be valid and reliable at a statistical level, we can use assessments for accountability. So we would want to ensure that assessments had that strength of technical rigor to be used for accountability. But we can absolutely use local assessments for accountability, and that we should, so that we have multiple measures informing our judgment of our students, so judgment of our the effectiveness of our educators and the effectiveness of our schools and the effectiveness of the district. Acuity is an external measure that's a common assessment. I'm just bringing it to light because it provides comparability, it provides accountability. It also informs instruction. The reason why its focus is more on comparability and accountability is because it's external to the teaching and the learning. So you can look at the items and determine the students have some gaps here and they have other gaps here. If you go too far down into the granularity, then you start playing what I call skills roulette. And that's where you make some decisions about students' ability or lack of ability based on 2 or 3 items about a skill, which can be very, it's gambling. You might have got it right or not. Colorado state assessments, which when we move on further, you'll see there's several of those. That assessment system is about comparability and accountability. You can use the data that you get, we can use the data that we get from state assessments for to inform instruction to a certain degree. And it's similar to the skills roulette comment I made about you have to be careful how granular you go. You really need to look at the more composite of a concept. And the data tends to be old quick. So if we're making decisions about students' learning based on data that we get months later, and then we might look at it again months later, by that time, that data has aged and becomes just more of what Dr. Minimi calls an autopsy. Acuity, or ACT. ACT is an assessment that we would say measures application and a bit of transfer of learning when we're looking at the intent of college readiness. So it's looking at, are you ready to transfer to college kinds of learning expectations. I would say that right now in our system, the only assessments that truly measure transfer of learning to the degree that we could really make a connection to college and career are assessments that are more performance-based, that really are tailored to how does the learning look in the actual setting you would use those skills. So CTE assessments are one example of that. There are a lot of assessments that schools have built or that they are able to access through different resources that provide that ability to apply and then actually extend the learning into that transfer in a different environment. So this gives you just a sense of the different uses of assessment and what levels of skills they're actually measuring. JeffCo's assessment landscape includes state-level assessments, district-level assessments, and school and classroom-level assessments. Today we will be sharing with you who, when, and how much. So who is being tested, when these assessments occur, and how much of it do we experience, do our students and teachers have. So I'll start with the state assessments. The way that this is laid out is the name of the assessment is first, so READ Act Interim Assessments. The interim assessment is connected to the READ Act. It measures the grade levels kindergarten through 3rd. The content is reading. All students have to take this assessment. It's given beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year. And the teeny print up there is that the direct costs, we compiled direct costs and indirect costs. So direct costs are how much does it cost to actually purchase the assessment. Indirect costs are what are all the other costs that then end up having to be used, what other resources are having to be used to administer and make meaning of the assessment. So the direct cost of the Act Interim is currently being paid through a CTE grant.
Just for completeness of information, when I read through this, it would be great if we could get an update to this that includes what the cost is regardless of who's paying the bill, because I think we're all paying the bill either way.
Absolutely. We can get that information. And the indirect costs, you'll see that we didn't put monetary value to that because there is a significant range of costs, but we can also begin to collect that information. Another source of collection of that information is through the House Bill 1202 task force. That survey is being distributed now, and they will be collecting that information as well. So we'll be able to compile our information together to give you even more information about the cost and impact. The time for the student, this is specifically how much time does the student take the assessment, and this varies by student depending on their reading level. So if they have significant reading deficiencies, then they are test longer because the assessment is going to be digging deeper into their needs. The time it takes for the teacher to administer the assessment varies by student. So for those students that take longer, if the teacher is a proctor, then the teacher will be assessing longer. The Act diagnostic is the follow-up assessment to the screening, which is the first interim, correct? So would you like me to go through each of these or just do an overview now that we kind of know how the information is laid out?
Good with you. I'm good with the overview.
Overview is okay, but please do call out distinctions, and then I would encourage the board, if something isn't clear on one, that you ask the question before we miss the opportunity.
Okay, so I would just like to add in a distinction to the Act Interim. The Act Interim is required for all students, regardless of whether or not at the beginning benchmark they demonstrated on-track performance. So what that means is if I'm on track beginning and I'm on track on middle and I'm on track end, I still am taking that assessment kindergarten through third grade. It's important to be aware of because that takes time, and there could be an opportunity for those students to actually be taking an assessment that dug deeper into their levels if they're far above the skills that are being assessed within this specific assessment. So it's something to consider with that particular assessment. The diagnostic is only administered to the students who have significant reading deficiencies and is intended to dig into that deficiency and determine what specific needs they have. TS Gold is an assessment that's a part of the school readiness assessment work, and it's currently given to our CPP and IEP students. That assessment is $9.95 per student and is currently being paid through grant funding. And that time per student varies as well. So any of the assessments that we're using that are particularly a one-on-one assessment varies by student depending on their level of performance. Any other questions about those early years assessments?
I have two, trying to really understand the impact in time, dollars, and indirect impacts to students. So the first is, are there any non-direct impacts, i.e. do students taking this test impact other students that are sitting waiting while they go through it, or out of class that day? Or are there indirect time costs to these tests that could be identified as well?
So we would call those opportunity costs around opportunities lost. So we can absolutely dig deeper into that. That would be information that is actually being collected by the House Bill 1202 Task Force Survey. It's looking at if you're doing this, what are you not doing that you could be doing?
Well, and if you're doing this, are you impacting other students not doing something as well? Okay.
As well as the technology part of it. So that's another part of the opportunity costs that are being considered as part of that collection of information.
Okay, and then the other question specific to this, but you can generalize it to some of the other sections. While I fully appreciate varies by student is the accurate statement, it provides no information. Perhaps you could
5
say—
minutes to an hour would be helpful.
Exactly. Perhaps you could give us a meaningful range.
All right, well, I think on our, so staff put together an extensive swath of information, and I actually aggregated it. So that would be my fault, not theirs. So if we go to, let me go to one of them and give you an example. You want to look for that?
Dibbles Next is a 1-minute probe for each student. It's administered one-on-one, but then if you move into diagnostic, that takes a little more time. So we would have to give you a range on those times.
Yeah.
If you could provide some ranges, that would be great. I know I'm asking for update items to this, but to fully understand the landscape, we're going to have to get enough information to understand.
Right, and I think this, I would consider this a work in progress, because you'll see that while there is an extensive list, this is the tip of the iceberg. There are so many assessments out there that we haven't even, schools have assessments that are tied to their programs. IB, AP is not on here. There are a lot of assessments that we could continue to add, and it could be a work in progress for sure.
Thank you. Mr. Newkirk?
Yes, as long as you're talking about the TS Gold assessment, you may remember last year the board directed staff to work with CTE to provide alternative assessments to TS Gold, which some parents thought was overly intrusive. I wonder if you might give us an update on that, and has the CTE come up with any alternatives, and what's the state of that now?
CTE just approved 2 more assessments that could be used by districts to meet the requirements of the statute. We have not looked at those assessments yet, but we believe they are all very similar in their domains and that they would be online assessments. So it's work in progress that will work with our early literacy team to look at those assessments.
Thank you.
Ms. Dahlkemper?
I just, as we were starting to talk about the number of assessments and the length of assessments, I think one of the burning questions for all of us, and that we certainly hear from our community, is a concern about over-testing. And I share those concerns. And I think for me personally, my hope would be that we would work toward fewer, fair, better tests, because tests do have a place as one data point among many, as we talked about a little bit earlier, in terms of letting us know how kids are doing. Are they achieving the standards? Where are they struggling? Where are they doing well? And I'm wondering if you have a sense, as you've compiled this information from the work on the 1202 task force, about where we might be in terms of that balance. And there was also a study that came out from the Center for American Progress, I think the group is called, that also talked about concerns regarding more district tests than state tests. And I don't know how that plays out in JeffCo. So I would just step back and say, as we look at the overall balance of tests, do you have a feel for where we're at, or is that something that's going to require deeper research at this point?
Well, I would say that absolutely, I can say we over-test our students. However, when we think about what do we value, that is where we have to really then make cutbacks.
Yeah.
So if we look at the top performing countries around the world, we test every grade level multiple content areas. No other country does that. So if we want to think about purpose and use, one of the questions that I ask is, what is the purpose and use? And then how much of it do we need to accomplish the purpose and use? So what is our return on investment, if we want to use that kind of language? And so right now, these are color-coded by what's required. So red is required, blue is optional. I would like to color code them by purpose and use. And are we actually meeting or completely out of balance with the purpose and use?
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I also think one of the issues that popped up earlier was comparability, again, as we talked about ACT, for example. And I also do think that there's an equity issue that's built into this as well. I would like to have some comparability to see how students are performing in different schools, and what do those measures tell us about additional resources or help that schools may need to ensure that they're successful with all kids, whether they're GT, whether they're kids of poverty, whether they're AP, high performing everyone in the middle, and how do we best determine that? And then also how this all ties in with educator evaluations, because one of the reasons we may be seeing an increase in the district tests could be in part tied to measures of student learning. But how do we get really clear about what's fair, what's better, what makes the most sense in terms of what we're trying to measure? And that still feels like a big piece to get our arms around.
Well, let's go to the next big piece.
Okay. Thank you.
So when we look at, these are measures that we have at the state that are required by the state. The first two, Colorado ACT and the Colorado ACT alternative, are around college and career readiness. And so those, while we can argue there's a value to having all students demonstrate their performance on this particular assessment, as we were talking earlier, there may be a value to having multiple pathways so students can demonstrate their ability to be college and or career ready based on the pathway that they have. It's a slippery slope, and we have to be very cognizant of that, because we did have a time where the only kids who took ACT or SAT were students who were tracked towards college and career, and so students who were tracked ended up being tracked right out of that opportunity. So instead of just marching students down a path and then they never can have that flexibility of moving across as they make different decisions, we would want to be careful of that. But this assessment, while it does not take a lot of time, arguably it's 4 hours for a student, which my daughter thought was hugely intrusive, that it does provide that opportunity to show across the entire state and being able to compare across the nation, that ability to have that comparability. And also it is a valued assessment by higher education. So I was at a symposium about 21st century readiness, and there were private schools there, and there were charter schools there, and there were higher ed was there. And I made a joke with the private school, well, you don't have to worry about all these tests. And he said, are you kidding? At the end of the day, the parents care if the students have the high scores on ACT or SAT. So I just thought it was interesting that they have the same accountability pressures when it comes to that end of the 12th grade experience. The second set of assessments, the WAPT and the Access, those are for our English learners. The WAPT is an assessment that's a screener, and so that's given to all incoming students who are designated as English learners, and then that places them, that determines their participation in Access. Access is an English language proficiency assessment, and it is a time-intensive assessment because it is require that one-on-one with a teacher and a student. The feedback that I've gotten anecdotally from teachers that have administered the assessment with their students is they found it very valuable, but they also found it very time consuming. So that's that balancing act that we have. Questions about those?
In this category of tests, I would just say that I appreciate the state's approach of having all students take the ACT. The comparability value is very useful in trying to benchmark, but I also deeply appreciate the dialogue about having alternative paths for students. It would be great if our students have the opportunity to take an SAT, as they do, but making certain that they understand what those alternatives are. I would hate to lose the comparability, however, because those opportunities are important when you're trying to benchmark and figure out what you're doing well and what you're doing poorly.
So the next set of state assessments, which are also all required, are PARCC and CMAS. So PARCC is the English Language Arts and Math, and you can see that that's 3rd through, so it's 3rd through 11th. Did I get that right?
For English Language Arts. And math
Okay.
depends on what course
Depends
you're
on what course they're
taking
taking, that's
in
fine.
high school. So if you were taking an Algebra 2 in 12th grade, you would actually take a 12th grade PARCC assessment. But if you're not in those levels in 12th grade, you would not take the PARCC.
So this is where they tried to be more thoughtful about aligning the assessment to the courses you're actually taking. They haven't yet been convinced that we need to go further down into middle school so that those students who are entering into middle school either in 6th and 7th grade and already taking algebra and geometry would be able to take an assessment that's actually measuring what they're learning.
Ms. Dolphin.
May I ask a quick follow-up question about the PARCC and the field testing that was done? I believe JeffCo participated in the PARCC field tests along with other districts and other schools. And I know this in part because my daughter took the PARCC test online. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what we know, what the results of that, some of the early results that have come in from the PARCC field testing in terms of potential adjustments that might be made, potentially scaling back, feedback maybe from the 1202 task force or what you've heard to date?
Specifically in JeffCo, the field test for us, we do not get individual results or school results or district results from the field test. What we did learn is our technology. So it was a great opportunity for IT and Educational Research and Design to partner to ensure that students could access the tests, that our networks were working, that our computers our devices would work. So we learned a great deal in the field test around how to make our devices ready and how to make our students ready for the test, because they also participated in the practice items and helped them interact with the tools that are now online. So that was our learning from there, but we didn't have results from that process.
Oh, I do understand the piece about results and that we don't get results back on the test. I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. What I was wondering is if we've heard back from PARCC as one of the districts that participated in the field tests to learn more about PARCC, just as we learned regarding online and getting our kids ready. Have we heard anything from PARCC in terms of the results related to the field test and how that could further shape the PARCC test moving forward?
One thing they have done is reduce the time it will take to take the test. So they heard loud and clear that it was a great deal of time for those assessments, and what we recently received from the Colorado Department of Education was reduced times for the assessments for PARCC.
So
That
scaling
was
back the
helpful.
time of the test,
Scaling
which
back
is
the
a
time.
good piece in terms of concerns regarding the amount of time and time away from instruction in the classrooms. That's a really good point.
Now, I'm not sure, they gave us times in general, right?
They gave us a certain time that we would need to set aside for those sessions.
Yeah.
And they have reduced the time we have to set aside for those sessions for each session.
Yeah.
Could you clarify something else about PARCC? I understand that, we've taken Common Core and at the state level and integrated it into the state standards. Does PARCC only test Common Core, or is it broader than that?
Math and English, right?
PARCC assesses the Common Core state standards. They don't have a Colorado version.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
But they're aligned, right? Because the PARCC test is one of the two tests that measures Common Core standards, and the Common Core standards are aligned with the Colorado academic standards, and it's just English and math, right? English Language Arts and Math?
And actually, PARCC will be called CMAS, in the state of Colorado. So the umbrella term from the Colorado Department of Education will be CMAS for all tests, and the CMAS Social Studies and Science are Colorado developed, and the CMAS English Language Arts and Math are PARCC developed.
One other quick piece, and I think it's also important to point out that Colorado educators, I believe, including JeffCo teachers and others, were involved in the development of the Colorado academic standards and reviewing also test items related to PARCC and Common Core, and I think that's a really important component too.
Ms. Williams?
So what I'm looking at is between the CMAS and the PARCC, it's about 40 hours of testing for a student. And the impact of 40 hours on a student is difficult. They do spread that out, for my kids anyways, over a 3-week period. And I understand with PARCC that you might be able to use it multiple times per year. Is the district planning on doing that?
Actually, I just want to clarify that some students take different tests, so to add up all the numbers and assume one student would take all those is not going to be 40 hours of testing. So if you look at PARCC, it's 10 hours for elementary, and then if you add, say, a 4th grade social studies, 3 additional hours, so it wouldn't be 40 hours for a single student. So that's good news,
Okay.
right? Because we don't want it to be that much testing time. But it is a great deal of testing even at that level.
And then just talking about the impact of students that aren't taking the tests at that moment. I know that in many of the schools, it's using up all the bandwidth, the library time, the extra supports in the classroom. They're all being pulled to that one area. It is a very difficult time and high stress for students and teachers. What are we doing to help reduce that stress?
Well, part of the stress will be the newness of the assessment. So part of preparation for that will be helping the transition into having the students taking an assessment on a computer, understanding the difference of that model versus a paper model, and then the readiness of the proctors and the students to work their way through the assessment. Part of the reason why we participated in the field test was to be able to learn ourselves about how to support that transition. And then the other part of the stress part will be absolutely critical in preparing the ways that the learning is being asked to be demonstrated will be really important for us to scaffold students to that so that they are familiar with looking at multiple references and making decisions about or conclusions about a question based on having to infer from several pieces of information, or there's lots of different types of skills that are being asked within those items that we'll need to scaffold as well. So there's a lot of readiness that is being built into preparation for the demonstration of the learning as well as the actual management of that process. Yeah.
Mr. Newkirk had a question.
It's just following up on Ms. Williams' question. I wonder if it might be possible for you to give us just an idea of, say, a 5th grader and a 10th grader in a typical year, so we can understand better really how many hours those students would spend taking their tests, and how many hours of instruction they'd miss because others are taking assessments and so forth. Is that possible? Just say, okay, any given 5th grader, any given 10th grader will take so many hours of the tests that year?
Yeah, we can give you that information. I'll just talk through an example and not adding up hours. But if you think about a 5th grader at the beginning of the year, I'm going to be taking the district benchmark in ELA and math. I will be, we haven't gotten to the district assessments yet. I will also be taking other assessments that are associated with the other content areas that are either school level or classroom level assessments. And so the layers, the importance is fleshing out purpose and use and value. So when we start adding on the layers, we want to make sure, to your point, that the district assessments, the school level assessments are piling on top of classroom level assessments, and is the value matching the impact on this fifth grader? So beginning of the year, then middle of the year, they're going to have benchmarks as well as additional school and classroom level assessments. End of year, then all bets are off. They have the PARCC ELA, PARCC Math, they would have the CMath Science, they would have they would have the end of year benchmark for the district assessment, and then they would have any school and classroom level assessments as well at the end of the year.
So it's about 14 hours for the state testing at the end of the year, and then an additional 3 hours for the district benchmark.
Okay. I think
On
Ms.
top
Stoltenberg was
of-
next.
On top of the others.
Courses, what they would do in their class.
Thank you. Just two really quick points. I mean, one of the things, a comment and then a question, going back to the online testing piece. One of the activities that I thought was so eye-opening when we held a meeting with the Citizens Leadership Academy, and I think this was maybe a year or two ago, was when we had samples of the former standards and the new standards, Colorado Academic Standards, and then we looked at the test items. We looked at TCAP test items, and we also looked at PARCC test items. It was night and day. And I think that actually would be something that might be worth us looking at as a board, because when you actually sit down and you see the test items, it's a big difference. One is more about rote memorization or regurgitate information, and that's an important, I mean, to have the facts straight, obviously, but more importantly, what was so exciting about those PARCC test items is that they really got at analyzing information, critical thinking, communicating information, showing evidence to support your answers. Those are all the kinds of skills that employers are looking for. And I think one thing that might be really interesting for the board is to look at the actual test items, and let's kind of demystify what these really are and what they're about and have conversations about that, because I do think some very good conversations were generated by looking at those side by side and seeing, again, what are we measuring, what's of value, and what does it mean for kids? So just one quick comment and something we may want to think about in the future for the board to look at. The other thing is, going back to online testing, one of the advantages of online testing is that we get the results sooner, and that's really powerful, I think, for our educators. And there are some fits and starts, and Ms. Williams talked a little bit about some of those and how you deal with that. Could you share with us some of the learnings that came out of the field testing? You talked about some of the things that we learned in terms of technology. Any key points that you would want to share with the board about what came out of those learnings?
One additional feedback that we had from students is they enjoyed taking the tests online. So it's feedback you wouldn't expect. But
They're
they were quite
tech-savvy
engaged
kids.
in the interactive computer items.
Yeah.
They thought that was a lot more interesting than the tests that they've been taking on paper and pencil. So we did see more engagement in the test from students.
So kids said they enjoyed the test, more engaged.
We field tested at all levels, and there was engagement at all levels in a different way.
I mean, that's a really important point.
And Ms. Williams had a question.
So it's my understanding from some of the teachers that I've talked to when they take the CMAS that they have to sign off on a waiver saying they'll keep all that information confidential, and that and tell me if I'm wrong, because this is just feedback I've received, and that they're not able to really collaborate with their coworkers because of that privacy. Is that true?
Well, when you're talking about a standardized assessment that has security measures, so that was the case with TCAP as well. The items themselves are considered secure. Now, any analysis of bias and inappropriate content is conducted prior to the administration of an assessment. So the conclusion we would take from that is that the state had better do their due diligence in ensuring that content is appropriate and bias is eliminated. So that is part of the development process. Now, with CSAP and TCAP and now PARCC, or all of the CMAS assessments, in order to ensure that inadvertently a teacher didn't advantage their class over other classes. There's an expectation that the assessment stays secure. There has been a lot of feedback to the state about the, for lack of a better word, draconianness that was felt about the way that these security measures were put in place. And so there was some reaction to the way that that was delivered, and teachers felt the input that was actually shared to legislators during the last legislative session was that it just enhanced a level of fear that seemed very inappropriate for the administration of the assessment. So that was shared with CDE, and did they make adjustments yet about that? Because that definitely was shared with them about the way that those assessments, the security of those assessments, and the way that they were implementing those security measures seemed to be a bit heavy-handed.
Well, and I know the concern that many of the teachers that I've talked to had was being able to collaborate with their coworkers helps them be better teachers. And so I really think that we are missing an opportunity.
They can do that when they get the results. So when they get the results and they're able to look at sample items around what the kind of questions that are being asked and the information and the performance of their students, the rationale behind a standardized assessment is that then they would be able to do that with results.
But they can't talk about how their instruction will be. Hey, I have this idea, it's been really effective. They're not allowed to do that?
Well, and that's because that goes back to purpose and use. So if the purpose and use of assessment is to inform instruction, then absolutely teachers should know exactly what is being assessed and how it is being assessed if it's an external assessment. When we talk about the state assessment, the purpose and use is not to inform instruction. And even in the technical manual, it'll say, this is for program evaluation. So absolutely, we can look at the results and we can evaluate our effectiveness of our programming and say, this is not working for our students. So it helps students, but it helps students at a program evaluation level. The state assessments are not intended to be a resource that teachers then go dig deeply into the items specifically, because the purpose and use is comparability and accountability.
And we have other resources available for teachers to be able to do that. One of the uses for our district benchmark around acuity is that those items are available. And so teachers can drill down into item level analysis. They can look at distractor analysis, and they can understand what are the misconceptions that my students have around this concept, and they actually can see the questions. And that's part of the benefit of that.
But to be able to look at data and to collaborate on data is very different. In a large corporation, they'll bring the brightest minds together to talk about how can we make this better, how can we teach better, and we're really missing that opportunity. I know that we're limited by state regulations here, but I really think that that's sad that teachers aren't able to collaborate and work together to make their classroom the best it can be.
Well, they can on the data end, on the results end, not on the front end.
Yeah,
so
it's too late by then.
So part of what the decision is then is, so if it's meant for comparability and accountability, then how much is necessary? And there are other ways to measure rigor, transfer of learning that are more directly linked to what's happening in the classroom. So if we have a state assessment that's about comparability and accountability, which are very important purposes for assessment, the question that we come back to is, how much do we need to accomplish that?
Ms. Feldman?
Going on with Ms. Williams, wouldn't it be sad if we couldn't collaborate as teachers? And I know as I've been into many schools and watching them do the data walks and the talking about kids and how are we going to help this group of children, I think it has been very powerful, but it is on the back end. What I would really like to see, and I believe, especially as we're looking at all these assessments, that we are over-testing our kids. And I'm wondering if there's a way we can look at the balance and the, and again, this may not be something the state does, this may be something we need in JeffCo. Let's balance our purpose and use. Are we getting to actually look at when can teachers collaborate? When can we have to, keep our hands tied? When all these things happen, and do we have an appropriate balance in JeffCo? And that's what I really worry about with the pages and pages of state testing that you see.
So if we look at district assessments, those are assessments we have control over. They're in our circle of control, our circle of influence, and they're more frequent, which is another consideration when we think about the concern about teachers actually having the information they need when they need it, and students have the information they need when they need it. So one of the contentions right now in the national debate is district assessments versus state assessments. And so the state side is saying, well, you're giving a lot of district assessments, and the districts are saying, yeah, but we value these assessments more. And so
we're able to use them in different ways.
Right. So absolutely, we can do a lot of decision-making, thoughtful decision-making, and reduce the amount of burden to our schools by being very purposeful and thoughtful about the assessments we require. So right now, those 3 that are red are assessments we require. So the question would be, what do we want to mandate, and what do we want to provide as optional? So the first one, acuity readiness, 3rd through 8th. Acuity has been a district assessment for a number of years.
7 years.
7 years. It, this year, transitioned to a different form, so that's why the blue is now optional. The form for high school changed, and so the use of it shifted. Some high schools chose to continue to use it, and other high schools said, we would like to know what else is available, and we are interested in measuring our students' learning in different ways, and much more interested in looking at college and career readiness versus still tracking performance on standards in an external way. So this is a conversation we absolutely can have around how to bring some
balance,
reason to the landscape.
Well, I just look at the pages and pages of red of required. Yeah,
Well,
there's a lot of requirements.
I'd still like to understand some of this red, though. Can you explain what you just said, that some of these schools look at the acuity diagnostic and are optioning out of using it because they want to know what alternatives they have? Well, what are some of the alternatives they have? What else are they doing instead?
Right, so we have a number of schools that are interested in, ACT now has a pathway of assessments called Aspire, and so that tracks it's predictive to, it's measuring the skills, knowledge and skills, but it also has a predictive value to ACT. So that's one option that we have high schools selecting. Yeah. Okay. Used to be Explore and Plan, but now there's additional. It goes all the way to 3rd grade. Testing companies are making bank. That's all I have to say. The other option is an assessment called Career and Work Readiness. That's an assessment that's given, actually it started as a college, a higher education assessment, the collegiate literacy assessment, and that assessment, high schools started to want to give that assessment, so they developed the Career and Work Readiness Assessment. High schools have been across the United States and internationally have been administering that assessment, and so middle schools in the same districts are saying, wait, we want to have that assessment. So now it goes 7th all the way through. We have some high schools that are interested in that option because They want to know, are our students able to critically think? Are they able to problem solve very complex and the kind of problems that don't have a right answer, the problems that it takes resiliency and effort to get through. They want to know if their students are able to critically write, which is different from just being able to write, but actually write to defend a position or a decision using fact and resource positioning. And so those are some examples.
Do we have any schools using the AccuPlacer? I think that you mentioned.
I think that probably is connected to the concurrent enrollment classes, has been my experience. So once we get that list, we'll be able to tell you.
So possibly.
We do, we absolutely do.
We do, yeah.
Ms. Dahlkemper?
I have two questions, and this question may be premature, so just tell me. But as you look at this list, as we look at district assessments, are there any that you see as unnecessary or duplicative, or is this part of our ongoing work moving forward as we think about striking a better balance among assessments? And hearing, too, your comment about the state level as well.
I think if we, to answer that question, can I just move forward a little
Yes,
bit?
please.
Okay. So,
Mr. Newkirk had a question as well.
yeah.
Well, it's actually along Ms. Dahlkemper's question. What's your gut feeling, Dr. Eaton, Dr. Morgan, and Mr. McMenemy, and where would our teachers be with the thought of possibly rolling back some of these assessments?
We'd be doing cartwheels.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So when we move into school and classroom level assessments, what's critical about our balanced view is that those assessments are connected directly to the teaching and the learning. So when we think about this view I'm giving you, because I want to differentiate between what it means to be an external assessment and what it means to be an internal assessment. So the assessments that schools and classrooms are using are about the learning that's happening in the classroom. So if we think about this as a learning, this is a course or a semester or a year. And the blue is the assessment that happens all along the way. The red is the assessment at the end to determine the students have learned. And the green is the interim tracking to make sure they're getting there. So let's use soccer as an example. I do not tell a student that they're kicking the ball wrong at the game. We have practice. We are learning soccer. And I, as a coach, am instructing them in how to have on-target performance of soccer skills. And not only that, but be a critical thinker about strategy. Then the green would be interim. We have scrimmages. Can you play the game? We wouldn't wait until the game to have them actually play the game. So that the school level and classroom level assessments are critical when we're thinking about, Ms. Williams, what you were referring to of that assessment data that teachers are actually going to use in a meaningful way in the collaboration and the ability to provide immediate feedback to students. So when we look at how assessment is planned at a school and classroom level, it's all about support to the learner. We want to support the learner so that when we get to the end, they actually are independent learners. And we are supporting them wherever they are, and if they're struggling, we want to get that performance plus. So we want that intensive support so that they become independent. And for the advanced learners, we want to make sure that if they've already learned, we're moving them further and we're stretching that learning. So when we look at school level assessments, there are lots of different types of assessments that do that. Classroom assessments, you can see that if you had an interest at all, we could give you a 3-hour presentation on classroom assessments, because there are many. There are many practices, there are different types of classroom assessments. The bottom line is those assessments are designed either by a teacher or they're part of a program or a part of a resource that they've planned into the instruction. The common assessments are assessments that a school and or a classroom have planned for comparability. So this is where we're actually holding, it's that little a to big A. We're starting to hold all students accountable to our most valued learning targets. DRA2 is an assessment that is one of those valued assessments used at many of our schools, and it's a literacy assessment. So before the assessments that were implemented associated with READ Act, there were assessments that were tracking that kindergarten through third grade literacy development. DRA2 was one of those assessments. And then ACT Aspire, I mentioned before as being an option. We have a number of our high schools that value that assessment as a common assessment towards college and career readiness. This is simply a tip of the iceberg of school-level assessments and classroom-level assessments, and you'll see they're all optional.
Questions?
Questions?
Is that where we are?
That's where we are.
Mr. Newkirk.
Actually, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but it seems like these assessments can almost be overarching in two categories, predictive and prescriptive, being that some of them will be they'll actually predict how well our students will do at the end of year assessments, and others will give them ideas which show where they need help in certain subjects. Could you talk about that a little bit more? Which of these are predictive, which are prescriptive, and how well have they been predicting what we do in the TCAP scores, for instance?
So when we talk about acuity, that assessment has the ability to be predictive of performance on state assessments. When we talk about assessments that are school level or classroom level assessments, those are much more informative of instruction and student performance in being able to support the students' decision-making about their learning and the teacher's decision-making about the effectiveness of the instruction and what needs to happen in adjusting that instruction. And we're at this transition where the state assessment was, at the end of the day, the state assessment is what the public sees. So regardless of the assessment system that's that prediction and the informing and predicting, when you're judged by this measure, then these measures all start gearing towards that measure. Now, in one theory, that's not a bad thing, because you're tracking towards the end game. However, if we feel like those are the targets that our students should be accomplishing in the end game, then we've accomplished what we've attempted. However, the reason why we're actually in this transition is after the length of time that we've had towards predicting and informing towards this target, we haven't seen that return on investment that was intended in that process.
All right, then as Ms. Dahlkemper noted, since we're doing these assessments online now, have we seen, especially in the prescriptive assessments, have we seen an improvement in the lag time between testing and results?
For assessments that are informing instruction?
Yes.
Absolutely. For those assessments that are school-based and classroom-based, as well as the state assessments that may be required, but they're much more tailored to the learning that's happening in the school.
What about for TCAP versus PARCC? Have we seen a shortening of the?
Not yet. As they create new assessments, they have to do the benchmarking and the process of cleaning the data and understanding the data. So it has actually taken longer just for the initial test to be able to establish those benchmarks. But they're hoping to make it shorter in the long run.
Yeah.
And that's just to add on that, that's a really important point, because as you're setting targets for our next performance goals, PARCC will be given in March through May. Well, CMAS will be given March through May, PARCC and the Science and Social Studies. We won't get the English Language Arts and Math results until far into the next year, because they will be first having to ensure the data is clean, and then they will have to set performance levels. So there'll be a lot of that initial administration of that assessment is truly a baseline. It'll just be original data, and they'll have to do a lot of work with it.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt Ms. Dahlkemper, but just to follow up on that, is that because some of the subject matter is more subjective versus, say, math? I mean, they can grade that probably easier than an essay. Do we see differing lag times because of that?
No, it's more has to do with, and Carol can speak to this more than I can, but it has to do with the fact that they're going to run all these analyses on the students' results, and if an item performs with anomalies, it just doesn't perform well, then they'll get rid of an item, or they'll put it in this needs to be revised. If an item is supposed to be advanced and students just, 100% of the students perform at a proficient level on that item, then they'll have to set the difficulty level of that item. So there's just a lot of work on the, once students actually take an assessment, you get a lot of information about the quality of the items themselves.
Okay,
And then they have educators come in and actually create the performance levels for the assessments. So where do we decide that you have the different cut points for performance? So distinguished command versus strong command, those are set by educators after looking at the data, and that also takes time. But that will be done once, and then it'll be ready for the next year, but that's a process that takes time.
Because thank you, because part of that is related to this is the first year we're implementing it in this academic year. This was a field test that we talked about in the spring. I wanted to come back, Dr. Eaton, to something that you mentioned about preparing kids for the test, which then brought me to the concerns that I think we hear from parents and community members and certainly educators about teaching to the test. And I'm wondering if you can talk more, Mr. McMenemy as well, whoever would like to answer this question, about the new Colorado academic standards, which are deeper and fewer, the PARCC assessment, which focuses on those critical skills that you talked about a little bit earlier, Dr. Morgan, and what that means. Because part of my thinking about all of this is, you know, look, if you're focusing on ensuring that kids are achieving the standards, the test stuff takes care of itself. But I would have concerns if we're doing lots of test prep that takes away from that instruction. Because if you've got good instruction going on in the classroom and kids are achieving the standards or they're getting within those standards, everything else sort of falls into place. Thoughts or reactions?
Well, in the ideal, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that if we're assessing the standards with multiple measures and we're able to demonstrate that with a balanced view, then one measure isn't dictating the judgment of that performance. If one measure is the judgment of that performance, then that measure becomes the end game. Right. And when you develop a large-scale assessment, unless we want to assess students for 40 hours, we only are able to give the sampling of items for a learning target is at the more aggregate of that learning target. You're not getting down to the sub-concepts and the skills, and so you can say something about how they performed on that more aggregate of the concept, but you can't say something about how they're doing on specific strands within that learning target, and so we start judging students and schools and now educators on one measure. So it's critical that we have, if our whole goal here is to perform better on the state assessment, then it's an exercise in futility because the state assessment's a large-scale assessment that has items that differ every year, and we never really know what it is because it's secure and secret. And if we view performance as judged by multiple measures, the state assessment being one valuable part of that, then we're not teaching to the test. We're not trying to outdo the test. We're actually teaching to the priority learning targets, and we're able to show through ACT, we're able to show through our district assessments, we're able to show through the state assessment that we are teaching those learning targets. So that's a long answer to that.
No, I think that's a really important response because it underscores a number of critical things. One, that it's about multiple measures. It's not just about one measure. And I think for me, the other takeaway is it's about how we use the data from the tests, right? It's not about being punitive. It's not about labeling schools. It's really about helping us determine whether all kids are achieving and are they on track to be college and career ready. So I appreciate that.
Well, and I sit next to, on the House Bill 1202 task force, I sit next to the representative from the business community, and he's part of the Colorado Succeeds and the website. And I give him a hard time because I'm like, why are you using one data point to grade schools? He's like, because that's the only data point we have. Give us more data. And so I'm like, okay, put your money where your mouth is. We're going to get more data for you, and then you're going to grade schools based on multiple measures. So
Yeah, for a much richer picture.
Ms. Feldman, and then Ms. Williams.
I totally agree. It's about, I used to think as a classroom teacher that data points were snapshots, and what I really wanted on my kids, I really wanted to know about the video. I wanted to see the whole picture, not just how they did on this particular day. And teaching middle school kids, so often they could, depending on how their day was, that kind of sometimes depended on how they would interact with the assessment. So I think that my concern is still that we have a lot of external tests. And with that concern with the external tests is the amount of time teachers are spending getting kids ready for that, whether it's understanding the technology, whether it's understanding the format of the test, the format of the items, and that seems to be a great deal of time. I'm really concerned about the balance between the internal and the external. From everything I hear you say is the internal measures are giving us better data about how do we know if kids are learning. Is that true?
well, the internal measures are closer to the learning. So they do. The external measures give us comparability and accountability. So there is a purpose and use. It's just that balance.
It's a real balance. But my other question for you, Dr. Morgan, is around the House Bill 1202 committee. You've referenced it a couple of times. You've said there's a survey that districts are doing. We're looking at all this stuff. Are there any other highlights of that committee that we should be aware of?
Yes, I think that it would be helpful for our community to know that there are, for parents and community, there's not a survey because of security issues. How would that be sent out to the community? So they're holding input sessions where kind of a listening tour. So parents and community that have strong opinions one way or another about this topic are encouraged to go to one of those input sessions. And there's about 7 of them, I think, throughout the entire state. And the legislative session will be very interesting because there will be recommendations coming out of the committee, not only for our state, but also for federal level, because CTE has contacted the federal level to find out what flexibility our state has, and basically we're told not a lot, but that could be changed with the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Act. So there's a lot of input that could be
Would it be possible, Mr. McMenemy, to get those dates on one of your, I saw you writing down, your Chalk Talk, Super News, whatever communication, so that our community has the opportunity to attend? Thanks.
Ms. Williams.
So one thing that you mentioned is, at the end of the day, what the parents are looking at is the PARCC scores. And with the evaluation, Senate Bill 191 being tied to the test, that's really where the stress comes from. So if parents are looking at that test, and that's the most important thing they're looking at because it's the big predictor and it's the statewide blah, 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 and teachers are evaluated based on that test, there is so much pressure on our children and our teachers to score well. And I know in the elementary school, when they spend the 3 weeks on the park and then another 2 weeks on the CMAS, it's everybody bring in your 20 juice boxes and your healthy snacks, and the kids can chew gum, and there's no homework, and they get an extra recess. That's a lot of pressure and stress to the test.
5 weeks on PARCC and CMAS?
It's not a full 5 weeks, but it's like intermittent throughout 3 weeks for PARCC.
Well, so the
They
time,
break it up.
if we go back, so that's an important point. If you want even more information, what we can share with you is this is time per student. Now think about this. If I'm a school, I have only I have a certain finite number of technology resources. So that time per student multiplied by number of sessions of test, multiplied by the number of technology devices I have that can be used, multiplied by weeks that I need to stretch the schedule out. So if you're interested in time per school, that's a whole other interesting view of this impact.
When you have a paper and pencil test, everyone can test at the same time. But now you have to rotate students through the devices.
So not every student.
No, but it impacts the entire school because your library time is taken away. You have to do very quiet activities. I mean, it's just the whole entire school is impacted for that entire 5 weeks.
Well, and I think it comes back to what measurements are valuable. And I think one of the key themes that we've talked about is that it's multiple measures. It's PARCC plus all the other measures that we've talked about. And I think the question for us becomes, how do we talk about that with our community to allay some of those concerns? And how do we as a board continue to have these series of study sessions about tests and what they measure, and are they of value? Are there assessments that may or may not be duplicative? And how does this all help us achieve those goals that we're measuring as a school board? And I think we have a direct role in talking about that and helping our community together make sense of those issues. I think the other thing, too, that we have to keep in mind is that you've got multiple measures of student learning, right, as well as part of the educator evaluation piece. So it's not just one single component, but I mean that, and we haven't even really touched upon that. That alone would be a really interesting study session to go deeper in. So we've got factual information moving forward to help us continue to make good decisions.
So there's recommendations being made around how can legislation be either, and legislation can be changed, legislation can be eliminated. I mean, so when we're thinking about how do we want to balance, the question is, how do we balance all of it? So there's a balance at the state level, and then we be thoughtful at the district level and be very thoughtful and careful about what we require at a district level.
Yes.
And schools then have the opportunity to have the space to do the measures at the school level and the classroom level that are valuable to the learning that's happening every day.
Yeah.
So the one thing I would say is that with the PARCC testing and CMAS, if we're really not getting the grade back for 4 to 6 months and the kids are already into their next year, how is that really helping the teacher be able to look at how I can be a better teacher, how my instruction could change, and also for that student to be able to see, well, hey, I really wasn't paying attention here. I know there's all those other data points, but if this is the primary one that people are looking at, those results are taking way too long. So I have to ask, how is that effective and benefiting us, especially when the cost of the test is so much? And finally is the data mining. All these tests that are being done, the data is being mined on our kids, and there's profit going on. And that concerns me when there are pages and pages of tests. Somebody is making money. Not just on the test, but the textbooks, the instruction, the teachers' professional development, on and on and on.
So the clarification for the time frame is for this first year, there will be a significant lag in the time that the data comes. In future years, the scores from the performance part of the assessment will come by the end of the year, which is why the performance part of the assessment's being given in March, because the scoring will occur in April and May. And the scoring of the end-of-year assessment, because it'll be computer-based, will be pretty significantly reduced because the scores will go, they'll be statistically analyzed for validity and reliability and sent back, so the timing will be very much shorter for that time frame. So that's a clarification for that point.
Something I would add briefly, based on both the comments I've heard from Ms. Dahlkemper and Ms. Williams, it's also incumbent on us to look hard at implementation, consider significant impacts like a 5-week impact to a school, even though it's not 5 weeks of testing for any one student, and consider if we can be smarter about implementation, shared facilities to rotate perhaps some students through it so it doesn't impact every school, other thoughts around how to do this better and with lower impact. And that's one of the reasons why I'm asking for your best estimates on opportunity cost, so we can see the areas where we really need to do some careful thinking about the best way to do this and lower the impact, particularly outside of the actual test administration time to a given student.
And we've
for those
thought a
around
lot,
them.
yeah, we've thought a lot about that because there's, from the scheduling side, we can tighten it up. From the student performance side, then we have to balance that with test fatigue. So thinking about, and then opportunity costs of balancing. So if I'm a middle school and I have 6th, 7th, and 8th, or 7th and 8th, and I'm going to test 7th on session 1, and then bring in 8th for session 1, and then test 7th for session 2, and bring in 8th grade, just ensuring that we're not losing performance by having the balance tip too far over from the test fatigue. We will navigate it this first year with the experiences that we learned from CMAS, Science and Social Studies, as well as the field testing, and get better every year at helping schools, support schools through that process. Okay,
I have one other question, and then Ms. Feldman, I'll throw it over to you. And the other question is, looking at this entire landscape, you have a better understanding of it than we do, although I fully intend to dig into this pretty deeply. If you had a target area in these state assessments, classroom assessments, district assessments, where would you go to relieve the testing excess first?
If I was queen of the day, I would reduce the amount of state assessment. And for example, if we want to track student performance in a comparability and accountability way, we could assess every year, but we wouldn't have to assess every grade in every content area. So for example, we could assess 3rd grade English language arts, because that's the critical content area for readiness for the rest of school. 4th grade could be math and science. 5th grade could be social studies. 6th grade could be English language arts. 7th grade could be math and science. 8th grade could be social studies. And then high school, let's let them have college and career readiness assessments tracking towards that. So that would be, I haven't thought about this at all, but just off the top of my head, no, I've thought about this a lot, would be my recommendation for how we can ease up. But at the same time, I don't see us ever going back to the day where the only assessments we have are school and classroom, because part of the reason why we ended up with a lot of high stakes testing is because there were students that were definitely falling through the cracks. And we won't ever want to be at a place where that happens. So there is a value. If we were given even more latitude and the state was willing to say, okay, we are going to give you a list of options for assessments that measure the standards, and districts have local control over which of those, and we have vetted that we can correlate the performance, because if you look at PARCC and Smarter Balance, we still have 2 different assessments. So the only assessment we truly have in a national comparison is NAEP, and that's a sample they do a sampling, so we could do a sampling as well. There's lots of different models that don't require every child to test every year in multiple content areas, yeah.
Thank you. Ms. Feldman?
Well, I think to go to Mr. Witt's point, we are so grateful that you were on the House Bill 1202 committee because you can represent what I heard all of us say is we're really concerned about the frequency and amount of testing for kids. I wanted to go back to something Ms. Williams said. I know that as taxpayers, we indirectly are paying for CDE's covering of the tests, but according to what you have here for the state assessments, CDE covers those costs, not the district. Is that correct?
True, but I think that the way you said that is really
I'm
good.
just reading what you have here.
Right, but I think that the point you made is important because it's a significant cost. Is it $48 per student or something like that? The last number I saw was interestingly high, and we are paying for that. If this cost was 20, then hypothetically those dollars would be coming back to districts. So in a way, the way you said it is correct. We are paying for it one way or another.
But I think there's other costs too. I mean, a student has to have a headset, a student has to have a secure place to take it, so they have the cardboard walls that you put up. I mean, then you have to have a certain type of computer. You can't use some types. So there's significant other costs we have that are beyond just the cost of that test.
So perhaps we can get that information as well, going back to the operational costs.
Yep. And sorry.
Go ahead, Mr. Newkirk. Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just, that's okay. I was just going to say, and I think we have to weigh all of that, right, with the notion of doing testing online and thinking about how we work through those challenges to help our schools so teachers can get that real-time feedback, because that is a real powerful tool. I mean, one of many. It's not the only one, but I think it's one of many. And then I also come back to what you said earlier, Dr. Morgan, about accountability and comparability, and that does matter, and that's also part of the conversation as well. As our community says, how are kids doing in JeffCo? Well, here are a couple of the different measures that we look at. And also, how do we know whether our kids are achieving the standards, and what is the best test that is best aligned with those Colorado academic standards?
Mr. Newkirk.
Dr. Morgan, I'd like to clarify something I think I heard you said earlier. Are you saying that there might be an avenue that we could assess schools statistically on non-prescriptive tests? I mean, certainly every student is going to have to take an assessment that will be prescriptive to that individual student. But is there a model? Are you saying that you can take a school and take a representative sample of that school that would be statistically valid, that would pass t-tests and those types of things, that might reduce the burden on the school such that every student doesn't have to take the test that they all are now?
Yes, that's how NAEP is administered, and so if there was a decision that the purpose and use of a state assessment is for school accountability and district accountability and comparability of performance as a program versus a student. So some of the questions that are being raised is it the job of the state to track a student's performance, or is it the job of the state to track a school and a district's performance? So if the answer to the question is it's the responsibility of the state to measure a student, then they would assess every student. If the answer to that question was it's the responsibility of the state to measure schools and districts, then you don't have to measure every student to get a statistically valid measure of how a school is performing and how a district is performing.
So how would it look if we did a statistical analysis on each school, say every other year in math, and then every other year in reading? Would that be a valid model, or would it significantly decrease the burden?
It would. We're already doing that in science. So we assess once in elementary, once in middle, and once in...
And isn't that what originally we wanted to see with CSAP way back in the day?
Yeah, there's an interesting presentation that was given by CDE to the House Bill 1202 task force around the history of that. I can share with you. That's very, you go, oh my goodness, because we just kept adding them on.
Yep.
Well, that would be great to see if you're willing to share it
Absolutely,
with us. I think I would like to see that. And with that, we're at time for this item, and I think we've had some great dialogue and very much appreciate the detail that you've brought and the conversations that we've had. I know we'll want to schedule another one of these to try and drive towards some ideas. Thank you.
We'll consider this a work in progress.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
And our last agenda item is superintendent performance goals. Mr. McMenemy did provide a straw man for some performance goal suggestions. We have 30 minutes to discuss our views on performance goals and what the priorities should be. And at our next meeting, we would finalize those goals. And so with that, I think probably the right thing to do, Mr. McMenemy, is to give you an opportunity to kind of present some of the areas that you would offer, and then we'll turn it into a board discussion.
So the first place I started was with the background where the board staff linkage policy for monitoring the student performance calls for the Board of Ed to evaluate the superintendent on an annual basis in October following the receipt of student achievement data. Let's see, it talks about end policies 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 have to be a part of that. And so that's where I started with, was the current ends 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And what I really did was I took 1, 2, and 3 from Dr. Morgan's presentation. That doesn't mean that's what we have to do, but what it does mean is that those goals, whatever the goals are for ends 1, 2, and 3, those by proxy become the superintendent's goals. Then I took a look at 4 and 5, and I said, if I was thinking that there was a way that I could quantify those, ends 4 is every student learn in a caring, safe, and engaging school environment that maximizes parental involvement, encourages community support. What would be some possible measures from that? And so I just thought these things, and I don't know if they're what you want to do, and I think that's got to be what the conversation is about, is where are the places that you think within our system, based on what you know of our system, would be some places where there would be some opportunities there. So that's ends 4 and 5. And then the other bigger picture item that I thought about was, this is the last year of our district strategic plan. And so we have to develop a new strategic plan for starting out next year. What would be some key elements that might be within that? So for instance, human resource goals or school effectiveness goals or capital asset and financial planning goals, possibly a communication goal. Would those be things that would be built into the strategic plan, or would those be things that where you'd want to see separate plans around those as we move forward? So really what it came down to was taking a look at what's required by the board and staff linkage policy, and then what's the requirements of the system that you would like to see improvement in that would be part of my goals.
Thank you. I'll kick it off and we'll go around the table a couple of times here. I very much appreciated the fact that you started with the ends and focused on the goals that this board has unanimously said are where we're going to focus on achievement in the district. So thank you for considering the priorities. That's very important to me personally, that we ensure that the goals mean something to all of us, top down. And so regardless of where we end up on exactly what the goal set is and the compensation opportunity tied to those, if you will, or what the rubric is for dealing with that, it's very important to me that a significant portion of the reward opportunity focuses on achieving the academic achievement goals that the board has set. Comment, Ms. Feldman.
I too appreciate that the first 4 goals were based on what we stated. Here's my worry, and I go back and forth as a teacher. If we say every student will have an ICAP plan, just one example,
they could be great quality or lousy quality. So when we state every student will, every school will, I am interested, as Mr. Witt would suggest, is really looking at the quality and how do we, and I don't have an answer, but how do we get to that quality? One thing I really liked is on 3.1 where you said every student will graduate career and college ready, and then you listed what that would look like. We're going to increase the number of AP classes. We're going to increase the IB diplomas so that we have those concrete things. It's not just every school will have or every kid will have an ICAP plan. And do you understand what I mean? That was my...
Yeah, I think
and I've done both. I honestly have.
Right.
It's very easy to say, well, the district will have this, check.
So I wonder if the answer is what's the minimum expectation around an ICAP plan, and that is what's instituted for every single student.
I think that would be really...
Being able to outline that would be important.
I think that
the same
would
be... with a safety plan. I mean, we have minimum expectations of buildings in terms of what they have for safety plans, and being able to say, here's what it looks like, and everyone has to meet this threshold as measured by.
Right, so it would look more like what you have with every student will graduate college and career ready, bink, be-dink, be-dink, be-dink. And I think that would be helpful to us as we measure.
Okay.
Mr. Newkirk, did I see your hand go up?
Well, I can certainly comment now, and I had done a little work on this because I anticipated this being a discussion item at our last meeting, so I'll make some comments that I had put down prior to getting your email, Mr. McMenemy, a couple days ago. I too agree that that our board goals are paramount in this, and especially for me, I see that third grade reading number is very important. So I was going to propose that we have a significant a percentage of that performance bonus tied to getting that third grade reading number up to 85%. Also, secondary to that would have been the fourth grade math number as well. Now, I understand that ACT wasn't really on the list there, but I'm looking at that, and I see that we're close. You know, we've got 21.5. If we could move that to 22 to be consistent with CSU's minimum, from what I understand, to me, that would be something worth exploring as well. And then finally, I'd like to see some measure of employee satisfaction too tied to this. So I'll throw those four out there for consideration, along with Mr. McMenemy's email.
And I'll just dovetail on that. I really appreciate the question about staff morale and how we look at that more closely, and ensuring that it's a good, positive culture and environment, right, that values everyone who plays a role in ensuring all kids are achieving. I too appreciate that the targets reflect the ends, support that 100%. Want to go to the human resource goals, and the first one, provide leadership to increase inter-rater reliability in the professional practices rubric evaluation system. I was really pleased to see this in here because I think this is an issue that we've talked about, especially given the conversations we've had about the Fact Finder report and concerns about ensuring that inter-rater reliability is valid. And one of the key questions that I would have is, how do we measure it to ensure that we know there is inter-rater reliability? What measures do we look at? That's one quick piece. The other thing I wanted to come back to is I also really like, and this dovetails with what Ms. Fellman said, that 3.1 talks about specific strategies to ensure every student will graduate college and career connected, as you say here. But one of the things that I would want to ask about is 3.1.1, increased number of AP classes taken. It seems to me that in addition to that, there's also an issue around increasing access to AP classes and increasing opportunity as well. And I would really like to see that folded into it. Chalkbeat did an article that looked at Jefferson High School, and I'm just pulling this quote. One of the things that the article pointed to is that it appears Latino students either have fewer options for AP classes or at the least are not taking advantage of some of the course offerings. Only 4 AP courses during the 2012-13 school year had more than 100 Latino students enrolled. is that something that we could look at, not just for Jefferson, but other high schools, as we think about how we serve and meet the needs, again, of all students. So that's just one specific example in terms of access and opportunity.
Ms. Williams?
And to dovetail off of Ms. Delkemper, I agree with what you're talking about. For instance, with Jefferson High School that has the highest number of free and reduced lunch kids there of, what are we doing to increase the opportunity for our kids with the greatest risk? And I love that you addressed the ICAP plan, because I think that's the start. That's the start of getting our kids to think about what do they want to do next. And just my own experience with that, I spent 6 months trying to get a special ed department to even consider using it or looking at it. My son was the only one at his school that had one. So I think that's very important for all of those kids, all of our children.
Okay.
I also really liked how under ends 4 that you added some more specific things. I'm talking about the safety plan, talking about the SAC and the DAC. I think that was great. And I love that you're addressing the teacher evaluation system. And I know that Ms. Fellman and Ms. Delkemper just mentioned, how do we grade some of these things? And so I had requested that Ms. Neal send us a copy of the teacher's rubric and their evaluation system. And I would suggest doing something similar, using your goals with a 1 to 5 score. And with that, so each board member would use your goals that you put together, make a rubric with a 1 to 5 score. We would each complete it with comments, and then possibly sit down with a third-party person that's trusted, maybe, where is he? Maybe Mr. Branham, where individually we could sit down with him, talk about what do those comments mean, and then he could go to you in a confidential manner and say, here's the scorecard, here's your report card, and here's some of the comments, so that you have a greater depth of what areas you're really shining in, what you're, what's the word I'm looking for? Just, what areas you're doing well in, and then what areas maybe we would like to see be a little bit different, because that's how we learn, is from hearing those celebrations. And
so are you talking about taking, say, 1.1, the baseline of on-target performance of third grade students in reading will be X, and having a graduated scale where maybe it's 80% is the 1, 85% is a 2, 89%, is that what you're talking about
I'm not sure. I'm just throwing an idea out there that I thought sounded interesting.
And Ms. Williams, I really like what you said. I like the idea of using a rubric. I think that would be good. I am against, this is just me, a 5-point. I would rather see something like the teacher rubric, which is a 4-point, and what that does is it forces us to make a decision, good or not so good. When there's an odd number, it's real easy to say, I'll go in the middle. And I would really encourage us to force ourselves to have one way or another. Like, I really appreciate this rubric having those 4.
Can I ask, how did we evaluate the past superintendent? Does anybody know that?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we know that.
Leslie knows it really well.
Yeah, absolutely. We had specific student achievement targets, which is this piece, that reflected each of our ends with specific data aligned. And that data came from the UIP, JeffCo call to action, and then we literally went through the results of these student achievement targets in Dr. Stevenson's evaluation. These weren't the only things that we looked at. The data was was a key focus in terms of student achievement and how we're performing and her leadership role. But we also looked at other kinds of issues like culture, and we can tick those off as well. I really like what Ms. Fellman is saying, and I love what you're saying, Ms. Williams, about creating a rubric that also mirrors, to the best of our ability, what we're asking of our educators, principals and teachers combined. And I think it'd be actually interesting to think about something similar for the board, to measure our own effectiveness and how we determine whether we're being successful in our work. So if we're going to ask that of our educators, our teachers and principals, and our superintendent, why not have that conversation at the board level? So I really love that idea. And I also like the idea of the 4. Yeah. There's one other question I had, though, about our math. I mean, I'll hold off on this, but I want to ask about the math target.
I also thought those were graduated percentages, though, in Dr. Stevenson's evaluation, weren't they? Where they said if you get X percentage of students to a certain place. So that was kind of how you
well, the nice thing about doing a 1 to 4 scale is you get some graduation in the, did we come close or did we just completely miss the thing? I like the 1 to 4, or at least I'm okay with the 1 to 4, as long as 1 means 0 in terms of didn't do it, and 4 means nailed it on the head, right? Got to be clear.
The way we have it for our educators, the highly effective, the effective, partially effective, and ineffective.
Yeah. Well, but the one thing that I would add to that, what I was trying to get to is, if we're going to do that, to address the other concern that I raised, what I'd really love to see us do is at least make the compensation opportunity split 50% on the board goals and then 50% on the remaining goals, so that we weight it appropriately, so that we know that we're getting to the academic achievement priorities that we're trying to hold to.
Yeah. So perhaps we can think about the rubric as professional practice results, like we do with our educators. That's a really good idea.
I mean, and some of this is already built in here, but, other themes that we looked at with Dr. Stevenson included fiscal stewardship, innovation and change through leadership and collaboration, fostering a safe, supportive environment for students. We know how important that is in terms of ensuring kids feel safe and they can focus on learning. Strategic communications, huge part of the position in terms of engaging different stakeholders. Some of that sense-making that we talked about earlier, putting it all together, the call for action, and then areas of continued focus and objectives as well. So if we want to think about additional components. But I think some of that is already reflected in here, which is great, which is really great. Here's my question for you all, and it goes back to the 4th grade math. And I want to throw this out, and I don't know if this is something that we want to change or not, but I would love to see if you have thoughts on this. For Mr. McMenemy, for the board, for Dr. Morgan, is this the right measure in terms of the entry point for math? Or should we really be looking at 7th and 8th grade algebra as a precursor to high school math and greater success in math? Is this the right measurement in terms of math as we think about that dip that we see in high school?
Just to respond to that a little, I would love to have the conversation, looking at our goals, specific measures. This is a special meeting. We need to keep our focus on the superintendent's evaluation. But I would we've got to set a new remediation goal. We know that. We met one of our writing goals, middle school writing goals, so we need to set a new value there. I think it's worth debating whether any of the existing goals should be altered. So why don't we take that on an agenda item to set the board academic achievement goals, but let's keep this discussion focused on the superintendent evaluation.
Yeah, I think it would be good for the board to talk about whether this is still the right goal, and it may be.
I do too. It's just not on this agenda. This is a special meeting. It would take a unanimous vote to change the agenda.
Oh, no, and I'm not suggesting that. I want to just open up that question, and we can certainly move forward since this is the end that we've identified. But as we're also setting the evaluation, we want to make sure we're measuring the right things. That's the most important thing.
So, Mr. Witt, because I know that I had some concerns about the goals too. Can we just talk about and I know we're focusing on superintendent, but let's just set a date. When can we review these, and then we can move on?
Would you like to do it at the next regular meeting? I would rather do it in a study session, so I would suggest we do it at the study session after the next regular meeting.
Okay, that way. Now, just a question. If those goals change a little bit, will the superintendent's evaluation change to go with that?
We could have that discussion at that point. I don't want shifting objectives, though, do you? I mean, we need to be careful not to move things around on the playing field. We set objectives, and we make sure that he has a chance to actually respond to them.
Yeah.
Right? The district has a chance to respond.
That's fair enough. Thank you.
Well, and I agree with that. I mean, we want to set goals, we want to stick to those goals, we want a baseline year 2, year 3. And I think we always need to keep the door open as to whether we're measuring the right things. And again, we may say the 4th grade math goal is the right goal, but I know that we all have concerns about what's happening at the high school level, and do we need to think about 7th grade algebra? Or I don't know the answer to that, but I think that would be a good conversation to have. And if we know that's a game changer, more so than 4th grade, I think that we should be open to possibly considering making that one change, since this is a baseline evaluation as well. So just a thought.
Yeah.
So is there anything on this list where you would say, you know what, you don't need to waste your time setting up a rubric for that specific goal?
I would argue that your question marks on 5.1, we can do without adding yet another category there. That would be my opinion. I liked the fact that you addressed strategic plan kind of as one set and goals as another. And if you maintain that separation, I think we do a good job of representing both sides of the equation, which is the operational side and the academic student.
Yeah, I think that's
achievement
really
side.
important to make sure that we have an academic and a business side kind of thing. We've got the operational, we've used that word before. Nice.
I think you did a great job, Dan.
Thank you.
Mr. McMenemy.
So I think the proposal would be to come back with maybe a little bit finer point on a few of these, recognize the 50-50 split in compensation opportunity, recognize the 1 to 4 scoring that we've heard. I think we've got agreement on those. I haven't seen anybody saying no, and bring those back, and then we can discuss any final changes in the November 6th meeting. But I think we're pretty close to a really good evaluation plan here. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.